Good afternoon, Vietnam War students. Mr. Powell here. We're going to go over some more stuff here through our notes. I'm going to pick up at page 10, so it's kind of all right there, the little starting point and all that you need. Going to pick up with the Tet Offensive, 1968. Basically, let me just start off with this quick reading here by Dr. Anthony James Joes in his Modern Guerrilla Insurgency book. He says the following: Tet, in the early months of 1967, after 2 years of large-scale American presence in South Vietnam, the Communists were taking enormous losses. In fact, the Hanoi regime imposed casualties on its people at a rate about twice as high as that suffered by the Japanese in World War II. General Giap told a European interviewer in 1969 that between 1965 and 1968 alone, Communist military losses totaled approximately 600,000. By way of comparison, from 1960 to 1967, 13,000 Americans died in Vietnam, fewer than the Americans who died in that period from falling off the roofs of their houses. This guy has some other nice statistics that, though not written here, it appeared in another book that he wrote. If you were a draft age male living back in this time in the United States, you had about a 1 in 50 chance of being drafted. If you were one of the people who got drafted, you weren't one of that. You were that 1 of 1 in 50. Approximately half of those young men drafted went to Vietnam, and of that half to Vietnam, not all those guys were combat soldiers. They would have been people who worked as clerks, or they would have worked in supply, or they would have been airframe mechanics or something else like that. So pretty small chances of actually getting into combat with the Communists. Also, the United States spent approximately 3% of its GNP, or gross national product, which is a way of measuring the output of your economy in a year. So we didn't really spend a whole lot, and the North Vietnamese were spending everything. So this war, by comparison, would have been like the effort level of, say, a World War II for America, or the American Civil War for the United States, where they're just putting out everything into the cause for winning this war. So with that said, they can't really get anywhere with their current tactics. So by 1968, they decided to have this Tet Offensive, and there were 3 main goals to the Tet Offensive. One was to destroy ARVN. ARVN is the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. That's the good guy Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, who are fighting on the same side as the Americans. Next, they wanted to cause a general uprising. In the South, Communists always believe that they have the most popular cause around, and that if the people only had a little bit of leadership motivation to instill courage in them, then they would rise up against the government in South Vietnam. And the last thing was they wanted to weaken the U.S. will to fight. There. Weaken the U.S. will to fight. So what they do is they come up with this Tet Offensive plan. This is, in a nutshell, it's a general offensive against all major cities and towns in South Vietnam, against all major military installations in South Vietnam, all pretty much at once. And the whole thing would be just this massive, massive offensive. So, a couple things I have broken out on the side here that end up being some of the main points or main historical kind of artifacts here from the Tet Offensive. Number one, I've written Khe Sanh, K-H-E space S-A-N-H, Khe Sanh. Khe Sanh was a massive Marine Corps um, base up in the northern regions of South Vietnam. It was up near the DMZ, or that demilitarized zone they call it, that was sort of the borderline between North and South Vietnam. So early on in this Tet Offensive, the North Vietnamese surround this base and they lay siege to this base. They sort of envision or hope that it would become like another Dien Bien Phu, or what Dien Bien Phu was to the French. That wouldn't happen because of American air power and firepower, but they would have liked to have seen it come that way. But the other reason they launched this attack and several other attacks out in the countryside, far out in the countryside, was because they wanted to pull American troops away from the main cities and the larger bases that they occupied and protected. And once they did that and lured these guys out into the countryside more, then they would have their uprising all over the place in the major cities. So Tay Son was under siege for a pretty long time, and the Americans were able to withstand the siege. Massive air power was called in. The North Vietnamese were not able to overrun this huge Marine base in the northern parts of the country. Another thing that became sort of a microcosm of the whole Tet Offensive is this place called Hue City. I know it's spelled H-U-E, Hue, right? But in Vietnam it's pronounced Hue. And one of my favorite movies, Full Metal Jacket, the combat scenes in Full Metal Jacket take place in Hue City in Vietnam. So just a little pop culture movie reference there if you guys are savvy and you follow some of those movies like I do. Anyway, Hue City is a very ancient, very symbolic city to the South Vietnamese, sort of like, maybe like a Philadelphia would be. It's not, I mean, Philly's not the biggest city, or it's not the capital city of the country or anything like that. But, you know, we had Declaration of Independence was signed here. We have the Liberty Bell here. We have a lot of really significant kind of things that are here in Philly. So maybe Hue City would have been sort of akin to that in some ways. Or like a Boston with, you know, all the stuff in Boston that happened around the Revolution, and Paul Revere and all those kind of guys, John Adams, Sam Adams. So it would have been a city kind of like that. It meant something to them in the South Vietnamese mind. Anyway, this city was briefly taken over by the communists. They took over the city, and as they go through, you've got the North Vietnamese soldiers and stuff that are there, but you also have a lot of the Viet Cong, which are the local South Vietnamese communists. And these guys have been sort of underground, but for this uprising they come out. And they've got lists of people that they think are a problem. People who are anti-communist, or they're in positions of authority in the government somehow that are anti-communist. And this list became, it ended up becoming a hit list. These people were rounded up, you know, if they were in the police or some school teachers, civil administrators, maybe people who were vocal if they were in the press or something like that, anti-communist, they were rounded up and they were executed. A couple thousand of these people were executed by the communists. And I know the communists wanted to have this general uprising thing that they fantasize about, but this Hue City massacre basically is demonstrative of what's really going to happen in the country if and when communists do take over. It's going to be a massacre. Thousands of people got killed here, and you can only imagine what that would look like on a nationwide sort of scale. So Hue City is also up in the northern reaches of South Vietnam, and that was mostly liberated in a lot of house-to-house urban combat type fighting. That was mostly a Marine Corps operation because it was in the north of the country, and the Army kind of had like the southern 3/4 of the country. So Hue City, it was eventually taken back. Also, the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, Vietnamese communists got in there. They got into the embassy compound and they were attacking the embassy directly, which is the symbol of U.S. power in Saigon. So how'd this really go overall? What are the real results here? How's our results? What's our scorecard? Well, ARVN was not destroyed. ARVN stood up and fought bravely against the communists. Was there a general uprising? No, there was no general uprising against the communists. Did it weaken the U.S. will to fight? Ding! Yes, it did. That goal was achieved. Why? You can really boil it down to pretty much one thing: the American press, the media, news people that are there. As we looked before, we talked about guerrillas and some of the things that guerrillas need in order to survive and thrive and accomplish their mission. And the Vietnamese communists abandoned all of those things that had been their strengths. The deception, to use the Mao phrase, to move among the masses as a fish moves through water, the camouflage, the concealment, hiding. The problem with the Viet Cong was that the Americans could never find the Viet Cong. But here, that's not the problem. The Viet Cong came out of the shadows. The Viet Cong attacked right into the teeth of the American defense and the South Vietnamese defenses. And they got cut down. After the Tet Offensive, the Viet Cong are virtually eliminated. We went through the varsity team of the Viet Cong. We went through the JV team and killed all them. And all that's left is a few guys left on the freshman team. All right, the Viet Cong got pretty much wiped out. And after this, the North is going to really take over the war to a much larger extent, even in the combat roles. So, U.S. morale, the morale and the feeling among U.S. troops went up during the Tet Offensive. They were happy. All the things that had frustrated them for so long, like the booby traps and not being able to find the Viet Cong, that went out the window. They blew these guys away en masse. But a lot of people in the press aren't used to that level of chaos. The film and the reporting that went back to the United States made it seem like the whole country was blowing up and that we had wasted the prior 3 years or so that we'd been there with combat troops. It made it seem like a whole big step back. Were Americans killed? Yes, a lot of Americans were killed in this, but the casualties inflicted were grossly disproportionate in this case. So because of the Tet Offensive, you do see the peace movement in the United States gain steam, and it changes things on the political front. Speaking of the political front, I'm going to have you guys watch some film on the 1968 presidential election. Lyndon B. Johnson, who's president and could have been president again, he could have run for president, he decides not to run for president. He quits. And you don't usually see that. Usually an American president's going to go for it. He quits because of this 1968 Tet Offensive. He goes on TV and says, I'm not running for president. It surprised a lot of people. Spoiler alert here, Nixon wins. So Nixon's going to take over the war after 1968 when he's sworn in early 1969, January 20th of 1969. And when Nixon comes in, it's basically no more Mr. Nice Guy. LBJ had run the war with certain rules, and he had certain boundaries and limitations that he subjected U.S. forces and U.S. strategy to, but that's over. If you look on page 11, that's where we've got Nixon takes over. Right about when Nixon takes over in the U.S., you've got the Vietnamese presidency is taken over by Nguyen Van Thu. He becomes president in 1967. So, what's that mean? No more revolving door of leaders, because they would just have a succession of different leaders, sometimes several in 1 year after the Diem assassination. That stops. There's no more coups where there's some kind of like military takeover of the government. This guy Van Thu puts a certain amount of stability into the South Vietnamese leadership. Right below that says Hanoi is reaching the crossover point. The crossover point is where Americans in combat are killing so many Vietnamese communists that they cannot replace them fast enough to keep up with the combat losses. So that means that there's the crop of teenagers who are reaching the age to become military age males, like let's say 17, just for example. The amount of kids in North Vietnam turning 17 is not enough to replace the combat losses that are being inflicted on them. So we were kind of getting near that crossover point right around this time, as Westmoreland, General Westmoreland had predicted, and that was part of his goal. But as we'll see, he's kind of on his way out. But despite this huge military loss of the Tet Offensive by the communists, they continued to have faith. Because, well, when you're in a communist society and you don't have faith in the program anymore, sometimes you just disappear, get shot. So they kind of are forced to be patriotic, where here in America, sometimes people are patriotic, but sometimes they want to spout off and say that they don't like something about the country, which is their right. But Hanoi in the north, they still had a fanatical belief in the justness of their cause, the inevitability of victory, and another thing that always helped them out was they believed in the strength of the Western anti-war movement. So that's the peace activists that are in the United States, other Western countries like Great Britain, Sweden, places like that. You would also see peace protests in other countries besides the US. So the communists, they're not dumb. They know about the peace movement. They know about the election cycle in the US and the ability of people to vote and change the program with their vote. So they sort of play up to that, and they coax that a little bit. Nixon, as a new president, is going to bring in a new team of people. Henry Kissinger is his national security advisor. He gets a new ambassador to South Vietnam, a guy named Ellsworth Bunker, new ambassador. Solid leader. He got rid of a lot of the strife and the backstabbing that existed between the State Department, the DOD, and the CIA. Made things a lot more smooth and the relationship better with the South Vietnamese. Also, the head general in charge is replaced too, bringing this guy named Creighton Abrams. Creighton Abrams replaces William Westmoreland. He has what they call a one war concept, whereby the communists are attacked politically, militarily, and psychologically. He asked for and got permission to strike more boldly at the communists. Like I said, under LBJ, there were a lot of rules and regulations and where you could go and where you couldn't go. And if there were places there that Americans couldn't go, then the communists would find out about it, and that's where they'd go hide. Also, they introduced this thing called the Phoenix program. I'm going to read a little bit about it right here. President Tu initiated the Phoenix program in 1967 as an effort to understand so as to be able to combat the Viet Cong/communist infrastructure operating in South Vietnam. What was known was that the Viet Cong, numbering in the thousands of men, exercised considerable control over portions of the rural populace through intimidation, coercion, and armed assaults. What was not known was how they operated, how they gathered intelligence, how they passed that intelligence from village to village and up to the communist hierarchy. Essentially, the Viet Cong had a shadow government. So if you think of local government like the mayor of a city, the governor of a state, they would have that. So there would be the legitimate village leader or mayor of a small town or village in South Vietnam, and then there would be the provincial governor. They don't have states, but they have provinces. The provincial governor. There would also be a Viet Cong communist at that level, and they would take taxes and do all the stuff that a normal government would do. So this guy too is trying to put a monkey wrench into that program and take that out. Operations against the Viet Cong infrastructure include the collection of intelligence identifying these members, inducing them to abandon their allegiance to the Viet Cong, and rallied to the government, capturing or arresting them in order to bring them before province security committees for lawful sentencing, and, as a last resort, the use of military or police force against them. In no other way, if no other way of preventing them from carrying out their unlawful activities is possible. By the end of October 1969, the Accelerated Pacification Program, under the command of General Abrams, operated by William Colby, had reached and in fact exceeded its goals for the year. 92% of the people living in the countryside were now living in category A, B, or C hamlets, meaning relatively secure. Traffic on the roads was near normal, except in known areas of VC concentrations. Life was beginning to be as normal as could be expected, living in a country under siege by communists. Even the enemy conceded the program's effectiveness, noting that the pacification program combined political, economic, and cultural schemes with espionage warfare in order to eliminate the infrastructure of the revolution. That's communist speak there, which is exactly what it was meant to do. Writer and historian Stanley Carnell was skeptical of the Phoenix program until he met with North Vietnamese leaders after the war. The communist authorities in Vietnam said that the Phoenix program was the single most effective program that is used against them in the entire war. So it's basically an intelligence effort. Sometimes it has a bad name because it was associated with the CIA, and ooh, it must be evil because it was with the CIA. Not really. I think what people would be referencing in that context would be the fact that sometimes it was abused. These people who were running the Phoenix program, maybe some U.S. advisors in there, but mostly a South Vietnamese effort. Sometimes they had their people in their family murdered or kidnapped by the Viet Cong, and sometimes it was used just to settle a vendetta. So that definitely did exist. So moving right along here, look at Cambodia on page 12. Now, if you remember, Cambodia is a country that's right next to Vietnam. So if I was going to draw a quick sketch of Vietnam, kind of come here like this, sort of fat at the top. It's a narrow-waisted country, and it gets sort of plump at the bottom down here, and skinny right there. So that divides North and South Vietnam. Here's Laos. But Cambodia is over here. It's this little sort of blobby looking country right here. That's Cambodia. And as we talked about, I believe last time, the North Vietnamese used a network of trails to kind of come through these two supposedly neutral countries, and then you could always come in here like that and deliver their guys and their weapons and everything, and then they could attack the Americans and South Vietnamese in that area. So Cambodia is actually very important to the North Vietnamese war effort. And under the Johnson administration, it was off limits. Americans couldn't go there, they couldn't bomb there, they couldn't really do anything to interdict that flow of men and material south. But like I said, with Nixon, no more Mr. Nice Guy. He went over with B-52s. They bombed Cambodia pretty good, killed thousands and thousands of enemy. They went through and did a raid into there. They captured a lot of enemy equipment, killed a lot of guys, stuff like that. It's pretty chaotic fighting. By that point, it was a lot of the South Vietnamese units doing that. Less so Americans than had been in the past. Nixon had a huge effort, what he called Vietnamization, which is to slowly pull American troops out. By the time Nixon was elected, there was over 500,000 guys in South Vietnam fighting the war, and he reduced that, year by year, 100,000 here, 50,000 there, and so on, until you get to, about 1973 or so. It's a very small amount compared to what it was. In 1968, there was something called the My Lai incident. My Lai is a village. It's in an area that was a hotbed of Viet Cong activity. And this didn't happen. This didn't happen during Nixon's presidency. It happened before, during LBJ's, but the story broke in the media and the newspapers during Nixon's presidency, so it kind of blows up in his face. But this My Lai village was it was massacred. Basically, the people that were massacred by U.S. soldiers. There was extremely bad leadership, and once the massacre occurred, a lot of the people up the chain of command in the higher ranks just covered it up. But these guys were frustrated and went in there and they just started killing people. Ladies, little kids, old people, everything. The guy who really took most of the blame for it was this guy named Lieutenant William Calley, C-A-L-L-E-Y. And he ended up going to trial, and he was found guilty, but ended up ultimately getting kind of a slap on the wrist for the whole thing. Even though a lot of people were killed in this village, they just basically wiped it out. That's the My Lai incident. It really kind of adds some fire to the anti-war movement, and even if it doesn't make people outright anti-war, even people who were in favor of going after the communists kind of held back a little bit after that, because it was such a disgusting incident. Here's a quick question here. Are you allowed to get classified government information and publish it in the front page of a newspaper? Is that legal? I would say no. But guess what? You can do it. Down at the bottom of page 12, you see something called the Pentagon Papers. Pentagon Papers were classified government material. They were stolen, and this classified material was leaked to the New York Times. The New York Times subsequently published this in their newspaper, and it puts kind of a black eye on the government. Basically, it indicates that some people in the government had doubts about the effectiveness of going into Vietnam. They weren't really sure what the criteria was to end the war successfully, or that there wasn't really a plan. And again, this is something that is really resultant from the leadership before President Nixon takes over, but it blows up on Nixon's watch. So it makes Nixon as the new president look bad as well, even though he wasn't, responsible for the whole lead up to the war and the prosecution of the war during the mid to late 60s time frame. So Nixon actually sued the New York Times and said, you guys got to stop putting that information out there, and it went to the Supreme Court, and believe it or not, the New York Times actually won. So before you get any ideas out there, if for some reason you ever end up in possession of classified information, don't leak it out, because if you get caught putting it out there, then you're going to jail. But however, if the newspaper people do have it, however, they got it by whatever means. Once they have that, they can start printing that. So it sounds dumb to me, but that's what they said. It was a First Amendment issue in the Supreme Court. And I think I'm going to end there. I gave you guys a lot today. So we're going to end at the bottom of page 12 with the Pentagon Papers. And I think that's going to be it for us. Bye-bye.